The earth had grown heavy with the dead. In the autumn of 1348, beneath the skeletal arms of London's elms, men dug graves in silence. The soil came up black and wet, clinging to their spades like something alive. They worked without speaking, their breath misting in the cold air, their faces wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar and rosemary. The city had learned not to breathe too deeply. In the churchyard of St. Botolph without Aldgate, the ground had filled. Every plot, every corner, every narrow strip between the walls now held bodies yard stacked 3 deep. The priests had stopped counting. They moved through the rows with censers swinging, murmuring prayers that no longer seemed to reach heaven. The smoke rose thin and pale against the grey sky. Beyond the city walls, in a field that had once grown barley, a pit gaped open. It was 20 paces long and 10 across, and it descended into darkness. At its edge, carts arrived in procession. They came from Cheapside, from Candlewick Street, from the alleys along the Thames where the air hung thick with rot. The bodies tumbled down without ceremony. Mothers and children, merchants and beggars. The plague made no distinction. By nightfall, the diggers would be gone, the field would be still, and in the morning, the carts would return again. Chapter 1. The Ships Arrive. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small and still. Perhaps you are listening in the gentle darkness of your room, or in the soft glow of a bedside lamp as the hours slip toward midnight. Wherever you are, whatever the time, you are welcome here. Before we begin our journey backward through the centuries, take a moment to settle in. Let the day's concerns fade. And if you have not yet done so, consider subscribing to this channel so that we might continue these nocturnal wanderings through history together. Tonight, we travel to London in the year of our Lord 1348, to a time when death arrived by sea, and the city would never be the same. The summer of 1348 had been unremarkable in its beginning. Along the Thames, the great river that served as London's lifeblood, the usual commerce of the kingdom continued without interruption. Merchant vessels moved up and down the grey water, their sails patched and stained from months at sea. They brought timber from the Baltic, wine from Gascony, wool cloth bound for the markets of Flanders. The wharves at Billingsgate and Queenhithe bustled with the noise of trade. Stevedores hauled barrels and crates from holds that smelled of salt and tar. Customs men marked their ledgers in careful script. The city consumed what the sea provided, as it always had. London in those years held perhaps 50,000 souls within its walls. It was a city of narrow streets and overhanging timber houses, of stone churches with bells that marked the hours, of guild halls where the mysteries of each trade were jealously guarded. Cheapside ran through its heart, lined with the shops of goldsmiths and mercers. To the east lay the Tower, its white stone rising above the river. To the west, the great abbey at Westminster stood in its water meadows. Between these landmarks, the city pressed itself into every available space. Lanes twisted like veins through the wards. Courtyards hid behind archways. Above the streets, the second stories of houses leaned toward one another until neighbours could touch hands across the gap. The people of London knew their city by its sounds and smells. The ring of hammers from the armourers in Cheapside, the calls of fishwives at Billingsgate, the stench of the tanneries south of the wall, where hides soaked in pits of lime and dung, the sweet smoke of bakers' ovens before dawn, the sour reek of the public latrines that emptied into drainage ditches running toward the river. In summer, when the heat pressed down and the breeze failed, the city became a cauldron of human activity, thick with the mingled odours of life packed close together. In August, ships began arriving from the continent with news that caused unease in the taverns and guild halls. Merchants who had been to Calais or Bruges spoke of a pestilence moving through the ports of Europe. It had come, they said, from the east, from lands beyond Christendom where the Saracens held sway. The plague had struck the great cities of Italy first. Florence had been devastated. Venice had closed its harbours. In Avignon, where the Holy Father kept his court, thousands had perished. Now it moved northward, following the trade routes, travelling with the caravans and ships that bound the Christian world together. The reports seemed distant, the concern of other kingdoms. England had been spared thus far, whatever judgment God had visited upon the continent. The harvest that year promised to be adequate. King Edward was in France, pursuing his claim to the French crown with the success that had marked the early years of his reign. The great victory at Crécy was fresh in memory. The siege of Calais had ended in English triumph. These were matters of consequence. A sickness in foreign cities seemed remote, yet the ships kept arriving. A Genoese vessel put in at Southampton in early August. Within days, the crew was dead or dying. The sickness they brought to ashore spread through the port with a speed that defied understanding. By the time word reached London, Southampton streets had emptied. The living fled to the countryside. The dead lay where they had fallen. Other ports along the southern coast reported similar calamities. Bristol, Weymouth, Melcombe Regis. The pestilence moved faster than any message could travel. In London, the city authorities took what precautions seemed reasonable. The mayor ordered the streets cleaned of refuse. Butchers were forbidden to slaughter animals within the walls. The drainage ditches were to be scoured. These measures had been tried before, during outbreaks of lesser sicknesses. They represented the sum of civic wisdom regarding public health. No one understood how disease spread. The physicians of the age held to the theory that corrupted air rising from swamps or carried on ill winds caused sickness by upsetting the balance of humours within the body. Protection lay in avoiding bad air, in maintaining proper diet, in the application of herbs, and in bloodletting to restore balance. The church offered its own explanations. From pulpits throughout the city, priests reminded their congregations that pestilence was the rod of God's wrath, sent to punish sin. The people were called to prayer, to confession, to charity and good works. Special masses were said. Processions wound through the streets, the faithful following behind crosses and relics, singing psalms and seeking mercy. If the plague was divine judgment, then only divine intervention could turn it aside. In September, the first cases appeared within London itself. A family in the ward of Farringdon Without fell ill. The father, a draper who traded in wool cloth, developed a fever. Within a day, hard swellings appeared in his neck and under his arms. The lumps grew to the size of eggs, dark and hot to the touch. He died on the third day, his body covered in black blotches that gave the pestilence its name. His wife followed within hours. Of their 4 children, 3 perished within the week. Only the youngest, a girl of 6, survived, though she would carry the scars of the buboes for the rest of her life. The speed of death was what terrified most. Other sicknesses took time. Consumption wasted the body over months. Fevers ran their course in weeks, but the plague killed in days, sometimes in hours. A man could wake healthy and be dead by vespers. A woman could nurse her sick child in the morning and lie beside the child's corpse by nightfall. The swiftness allowed no time for preparation, no time for the proper rituals of dying. Last rites were administered in haste, if at all. Wills went unwritten. The dead departed without settling their accounts with God or man. As September gave way to October, more cases appeared. They clustered first in the eastern wards near the docks where the merchant ships unloaded their cargo. Families in Billingsgate and Tower Ward reported sickness. Then the plague jumped across the city, appearing simultaneously in Cripplegate and Aldersgate. It seemed to respect no boundary, no barrier of wealth or status. The great stone houses of merchants were struck as readily as the cramped tenements where labourers lived 6 to a room. Monasteries reported deaths among their brothers. The palace of the Bishop of London recorded losses among its household staff. The city's physicians found themselves helpless. They prescribed theriac, that ancient compound of dozens of ingredients believed to counteract poison. They applied poultices of lily root and dried figs to the swellings. They bled their patients, hoping to drain the corrupted humours. They advised the burning of aromatic woods and herbs to purify the air. Nothing availed. The death rate among physicians was, if anything, higher than among the general population. Their close attendance on the sick exposed them repeatedly to whatever carried the contagion. Some physicians fled. Others remained at their posts, visiting the sick, even as their colleagues fell around them. One learned doctor, trained at the universities of Paris and Bologna, kept careful notes of his observations. He recorded the progression of symptoms, the sudden onset of fever and chills, the appearance of the buboes in the neck, armpits and groin, the black spots that spread across the skin like ink stains, the delirium that preceded death. In a few cases, he noted, the buboes burst and drained, and these patients sometimes survived. But for the vast majority, death came regardless of treatment. His notes would be found after his own death in November, carefully filed among his medical texts. By late October, London understood that it faced a catastrophe unlike any in living memory. The plague was not subsiding, it was accelerating. Every day brought fresh reports of death. The bells of the city's 100 parish churches rang almost continuously for funerals. The sound became a constant background to life, a tolling that marked the passage of souls from this world to the next. People learned to recognise the particular rhythms, a single bell for a commoner, multiple bells for someone of station, the great bell of St. Paul's for members of the clergy or nobility. The markets began to fail. Vendors who had sold fish or vegetables in Cheapside for 20 years stopped coming. Either they were dead, or they feared to enter the crowded streets where infection lurked. Food prices climbed, bread cost twice what it had in summer. Fresh meat became scarce. The Bakers' Guild reported that half its members had perished. The brewers could not maintain production. Essential trades collapsed as their practitioners died. In the taverns and alehouses that remained open, men spoke in low voices about the end of days. Was this not prophesied? Pestilence and death, famine and war, these were the signs that preceded the final judgment. Some recalled the strange celestial phenomena of recent years. A great comet had been seen. There had been earthquakes in distant lands. Surely these were omens. The world was groaning toward its conclusion, and they were living in the final generation of mankind. The nights grew longer as autumn deepened. The city, which had always been alive with noise even after dark, fell into an unnatural quiet. People barred their doors at sunset and did not venture out. The watch that patrolled the streets reported entire lanes where no light showed in any window. Houses stood empty, their inhabitants dead or fled. Dogs roamed in packs, feeding on what they found. Rats grew bold, emerging in daylight to scavenge in the piles of refuse that no one cleared anymore. Ships continued to arrive at the wharves, but fewer than before. Some carried crews already dying. Others arrived with no living soul aboard, drifting up the Thames on the tide, their sails hanging slack, their decks empty except for the bodies. The customs men learned to approach such vessels with caution, though caution provided little protection. The plague seemed to cling to cargo and timber, to cloth and rope, waiting to claim new victims. In the great hall of the Guildhall, the city's aldermen met to discuss measures. The gatherings grew smaller with each session, as death claimed members of the council. They passed ordinances that could not be enforced. They allocated funds for additional gravediggers, though able-bodied men willing to handle the dead were increasingly scarce. They sent desperate messages to the king, requesting aid, guidance, some acknowledgement of London's suffering. The replies, when they came, offered prayers but little else. The kingdom itself was paralysed by the plague's advance. And still the ships arrived, rocking gently at anchor in the grey water, their holds full of goods that no one came to claim, their masts creaking in the autumn wind, their decks washed by rain that fell without cease as October died and November was born. Chapter 2. The First Deaths. The plague announced itself differently in each household, but the pattern remained constant. First came the fever, striking without warning in the early hours before dawn. A woman would wake shivering despite the warmth of her blankets, her skin burning to the touch. A child would cry out in the night, calling for water that brought no relief. A merchant would rise to begin his day and find his legs unsteady, his head swimming with a heat that seemed to come from within his very bones. In the ward of Eastcheap, where the prosperous tradesmen kept their shops and residences, The sickness came to the household of William Morstede in the second week of October. Morstede was a respected apothecary, a man of learning who had studied the properties of herbs and compounds for 30 years. His shop occupied the ground floor of a timber-framed house that leaned slightly eastward, as all old buildings in London seemed to do. Above the shop, his family lived in rooms that smelled perpetually of the dried plants and minerals that were the tools of his trade. His apprentice, a boy named Thomas from a village in Kent, fell ill first. The lad was 14, strong and healthy, quick to learn and cheerful in his disposition. He had been grinding dried wormwood in the back room when the fever seized him. One moment he worked the pestle in steady rhythm. The next, he stumbled and caught himself against the wooden counter. Morstede, measuring out quantities of rose oil at the front of the shop, heard the pestle clatter to the floor. The boy's face had gone pale as parchment. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air. Morstede helped him to a stool and felt his brow. The heat radiating from the boy's skin told the apothecary everything he needed to know. This was not the common fever that came with autumn's damp. This was something else, something he had heard described but not yet encountered. He sent for his wife to prepare a bed while he closed the shop's shutters and bolted the door. By evening, the swellings had appeared. They emerged first in the boy's neck just below his jaw, hard lumps that grew as Morstede watched, rising beneath the skin like eggs pushing up through shallow earth. Thomas whimpered but did not cry out. He was a country boy, accustomed to bearing pain without complaint. His master applied poultices of lily root mixed with butter and honey, an old remedy said to draw out poisons. The boy's mother had taught him that preparation when he was small. Now, working by candlelight in the narrow room above the shop, Morstede found himself whispering the prayer his own mother had taught him. Words in Latin he only half understood. The household kept vigil through the night. Morstede's wife, Margaret, sat beside the boy's pallet with a basin of water and cloths to cool his fever. Their daughter Alice, a girl of 16 who helped in the shop, prepared infusions of fever, few and chamomile. Their son John, just 12 years old, watched from the doorway with wide eyes. He had never seen sickness like this. None of them had. Thomas died at dawn. The moment came quietly, without struggle or final words. One breath, then another, then nothing. The silence in the room seemed to expand, filling every corner. Margaret closed the boy's eyes and folded his hands across his chest. Morstede stood at the window looking down into Eastcheap where the first vendors were setting up their stalls. Life continued in the street below. The world had not stopped for one apprentice boy from Kent. The law required that death be reported to the parish priest. Morstede walked through the grey morning to St. Clement Eastcheap, the church where his family had worshipped for 2 generations. Father Edmund, a man of 60 with hands gnarled by age, listened to the apothecary's report without surprise. 3 other households in the parish had reported similar deaths in the past 2 days. The priest would come after morning mass to administer the final blessing, though the soul had already departed. He would note the death in the parish register. The body would need to be buried quickly before sunset if possible. Morstede returned home to find his wife weeping in the shop. Not for Thomas, though she had been fond of the boy. She wept because their daughter Alice now lay in the same bed where Thomas had died that morning. The girl had been well at dawn. She had helped her mother wash the apprentice's body and prepare it for burial. She had broken her fast with bread and small beer. Then, climbing the stairs to her own small chamber, she had collapsed. The fever had claimed her before midday. The swellings came faster in Alice than they had in Thomas. By afternoon, the buboes bulged in her neck and armpits, black and angry. She drifted in and out of delirium, sometimes calling for her mother, sometimes speaking to people who were not there. Margaret never left her side. She bathed her daughter's face with cool water. She spooned weak broth between the girl's lips. She prayed without ceasing, her rosary beads clicking softly in the dim room. Morstede exhausted every remedy in his considerable knowledge. He administered theriac, that legendary compound of viper's flesh and rare herbs brought at great expense from Venice. He applied bleeding, opening a vein in Alice's arm to drain the corrupted humours. He burned juniper and frankincense, filling the room with aromatic smoke. He consulted the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates, searching for some treatment he had overlooked. Nothing helped. The plague followed its own course, indifferent to the learning of centuries. Alice died on the second day of her illness. Unlike Thomas, her passing was difficult. She struggled for breath at the end, her body convulsing, her hands clutching at the blankets. When it was over, Margaret would not release her daughter's body. She held the girl in her arms, rocking slowly, keening in a low voice that seemed to come from somewhere beyond grief. Morstede had to gently pry his wife's arms loose so that Alice could be prepared for burial. The parish church of St. Clement had run out of space in its small graveyard. Father Edmund directed the family to the churchyard of St. Mary Woolnoth, 2 streets away, where room remained along the northern wall. The gravedigger, a man who had spent his life in that profession, worked with a cloth tied across his face and gloves on his hands. He had buried 11 plague victims in the past week. His fee had tripled. He no longer attended the funeral rites, but simply filled in the grave and moved on to dig the next. The burial took place at dusk on a day that had been grey from dawn. A cold rain fell, turning the churned earth of the graveyard to mud. Morstede, his wife and his son stood beside the grave while Father Edmund recited the prayers for the dead. Other families were burying their own dead nearby. The priest moved from grave to grave, his voice steady. His Latin was barely audible above the rain. No bells rang. There were too many dead for the bells to mark them all. When they returned home, young John complained of feeling cold. Morstede felt his son's forehead and found it hot. The boy's eyes had gone glassy. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy quality. The apothecary looked at his wife across their son's head and saw his own understanding reflected in her face. They had perhaps 3 days, perhaps less. John lasted 2 days. He was young and his body fought the infection with a ferocity that made his suffering worse. The fever climbed until he could not recognize his own parents. The buboes erupted in his groin and armpits, weeping a foul-smelling discharge that stained the linens. His body became covered in the dark blotches that gave the pestilence its name, patches of blackened skin that spread like spilled ink. Margaret sat with him every hour, singing the lullabies she had sung when he was small. Morstede measured out useless medicines with shaking hands, no longer believing they would help but unable to simply watch his son die without attempting something. The boy died on a Sunday morning while the bells of London's churches called the faithful to Mass. Morstede heard those bells and wondered how many would answer the summons, how many lay dying in houses like his own, how many had already fled the city, abandoning their homes and livelihoods in search of safety that existed nowhere. They buried John beside his sister in the crowded graveyard of St. Mary Woolnoth. Father Edmund was not available. He had fallen ill himself and lay dying in the rectory. A young priest from another parish, barely old enough to have completed his ordination, performed the rites. He stammered through the Latin, clearly terrified, eager to finish and leave. The gravedigger filled in the grave before the family had even left the churchyard. There were others waiting. That night, as Morstede sat alone in his shop surrounded by jars and bottles that promised healing they could not deliver, his wife came down the stairs and stood in the doorway. She said nothing. She did not need to. He could see the fever in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. She moved slowly, as if her body had already begun the process of departing this world. William Morstede, the apothecary, who had dedicated his life to the understanding of medicines and the healing of the sick, could only rise from his stool and go to his wife. He held her while she wept. They stood together in the darkened shop, 2 people who had built a life together, over 20 years of marriage, who had raised children and prospered in their trade, who had believed themselves blessed by God with health and modest wealth. All of it was ending. They both knew it. The plague did not leave survivors in its wake, not in families it visited completely. Margaret died on the 3rd day. She went quietly, slipping away in the afternoon while autumn light filtered weakly through the shuttered windows. Morstede prepared her body himself, washing her with water he had heated over the fire, dressing her in her best gown, the blue wool she had worn to their daughter's wedding 3 years before. He combed her grey hair and folded her hands around her rosary. Then he lay down beside her on the bed they had shared for 2 decades and waited for his own fever to begin. It came that night. He felt the cold first, the unnatural chill that preceded the burning heat. He knew every stage of what would follow. He had watched it claim 4 people he loved. Now it was his turn. He did not resist. He did not pray for deliverance. He simply lay in the darkness, listening to the rain against the shutters, waiting for the end. A neighbour, a cobbler named Richard, who had known the family for years, found the bodies 3 days later. The smell had drawn him to investigate. He pushed open the shop door, which Morstade had left unbolted, and found the apothecary dead in his bed upstairs, his wife beside him. The shop below had been ransacked. Thieves had taken advantage of the absence of life to steal what they could. Jars lay broken on the floor, their contents spilled and mixed. The careful order of 30 years of work had been destroyed in a single night of looting. Richard reported the deaths to the parish authorities. He helped load the bodies onto a cart that came around at dawn, collecting the dead from each ward. The Morstade family, all 5 of them, were buried together in a pit outside the city walls, in a field that had been consecrated in haste to receive the overflow of the dead. No marker was placed. No record was kept of exactly where in that field they were laid. They simply disappeared into the earth, their names surviving only in the parish register where Father Edmund, in his final hours before his own death, had made careful note of each passing. The house in Eastcheap stood empty through the winter. No one wanted to live in a place where an entire family had been extinguished. The shop was eventually cleaned out and rented to a chandler who needed premises. But for months afterward, people crossed the street rather than walk past the building, where William Morstade the apothecary had discovered that all his learning meant nothing against the pestilence that had come from the east. Chapter 3. The pestilence spreads. October faded into November, and with the changing month came the realization that the plague would not burn itself out quickly. The initial wave of deaths had been terrible, but it had been possible to imagine an ending. Now, as the death toll mounted daily, as entire households vanished and streets fell silent, the people of London understood that they faced not a brief calamity, but a sustained siege by an enemy they could neither see nor fight. The plague moved through the city like water finding its level, seeping into every ward, every parish, every corner, where people lived pressed together. It crossed social boundaries with an indifference that seemed almost deliberate. The wealthy merchant in his stone house died as readily as the beggar in his hovel. The nobleman in his London residence succumbed alongside the servant who emptied his chamber pot. Rank and privilege offered no protection, neither did piety. The monastery of the Friars Minor near Newgate reported that half its brothers had perished within a month. The house of the Augustinian canons lost 3/4 of its community. The physicians of London, those who had not already fled or died, met in the hall of their guild to discuss what could be done. They were learned men, trained in the universities of Europe, familiar with the medical texts that had been copied and studied for 1,000 years. They understood disease through the lens of classical theory. Illness arose from an imbalance of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatment consisted of restoring balance through diet, bloodletting, purging, and the application of appropriate herbs and compounds. This understanding had served for centuries. It explained most ailments and guided most cures. But the plague defied their understanding. It killed too quickly for humoral theory to explain. It struck seemingly at random, taking some while sparing others who had been equally exposed. The treatments that should have worked, the carefully prepared compounds, the precisely calculated bloodletting, the dietary prescriptions, all failed with a consistency that suggested something fundamentally different about this disease. Some physicians began to wonder in private conversations whether their entire understanding of medicine was insufficient, whether the plague represented something outside the natural order altogether. One theory gained currency among the learned men of the city. The pestilence, they argued, resulted from a corruption of the air itself. Some great disturbance, perhaps an earthquake in distant lands, perhaps the unusual alignment of planets, had released poisonous vapours into the atmosphere. These vapours, invisible and odourless, drifted on the wind and settled in low-lying areas where people lived in close quarters. When inhaled, the corrupted air upset the balance of humours so severely that death followed in days. This theory at least suggested preventative measures. If bad air caused the disease, then good air might protect against it. The physicians recommended burning aromatic substances to purify the atmosphere. Throughout London, those who could afford it kept fires burning constantly, feeding them with juniper, rosemary, lavender and frankincense. The smell of these burning herbs mingled with the underlying stench of death that had begun to pervade the city. In the wealthier neighbourhoods, the air hung heavy with competing perfumes. In the poorer wards, where people could not afford exotic incenses, they burned whatever green wood they could gather, filling their rooms with acrid smoke that at least masked other odours. The physicians also recommended fleeing corrupted air entirely. Those with means should remove themselves to the countryside to higher ground where the air was purer. This advice, though sound according to the medical understanding of the age, proved disastrous for the city's ability to function. The first to leave were those whose wealth gave them the option. Merchants who maintained country estates packed their households and departed. Minor nobility who kept London residences for convenience shuttered their houses and retreated to their manors. Guildmasters, aldermen, and prosperous tradesmen followed. By mid-November, whole streets in the western ward stood empty, the houses locked, the workshops closed. The flight of the wealthy created cascading problems. With guildmasters gone, the apprentices and journeymen who worked under them found themselves without employment. Servants who had depended on regular wages were dismissed or abandoned. The markets that served the prosperous neighbourhoods closed for lack of custom. The intricate web of economic relationships that sustained the city began to unravel. Those who remained, the poor and the bound, found themselves trapped in an increasingly desperate situation. The church struggled to maintain its functions in the face of mounting losses. Parish priests died in alarming numbers, their duty to administer last rites bringing them into close contact with the sick. For many priests, the calling was absolute. They attended the dying regardless of personal risk, bringing the sacraments to households where death had already claimed most of the family. These men died as they had lived, in service to their flock. Their example was noted and praised, but their deaths left parishes without spiritual leadership, without someone to perform marriages, baptisms and funerals, without someone to maintain the rhythms of religious life that gave structure to existence. The Bishop of London, from his palace near St. Paul's Cathedral, issued dispensations to address the crisis. Laymen could hear confessions if no priest was available. Burials could proceed without full rites if necessary. Multiple bodies could be blessed together. These concessions, unthinkable in ordinary times, became necessary accommodations to reality. Even so, the church found itself overwhelmed. The rituals that were meant to ease the transition from life to death, to provide comfort to the living, and speed the dead toward judgment, simply could not be performed for everyone who died. The living learned to recognize the signs of approaching plague. The fever came first, often striking in the early morning hours. Then the characteristic swellings, the buboes that gave the disease its medical name. These appeared most commonly in the neck, armpits, and groin, the places where the body's nodes clustered. The buboes grew rapidly, becoming large and dark, filled with fluid and blood. In some cases they burst, releasing a foul discharge. Those whose buboes burst and drained sometimes survived, though they were left weakened and scarred. But for most victims, the buboes remained hard and swollen until death. The black spots that appeared on the skin in the final stages gave the plague its common name. These dark blotches, ranging from purple to black, spread across the torso and limbs. They mark the death of blood vessels beneath the skin, the collapse of circulation as the body's systems failed. Once the spots appeared, death usually followed within hours. The final moments were often marked by delirium, By unconsciousness, by breathing that grew increasingly laboured until it simply stopped. People developed their own theories about who would die and who might survive. The very young and the very old seemed particularly vulnerable. Pregnant women almost always died, and their unborn children with them. Those who already suffered from other ailments, dropsy or consumption or palsy, succumbed quickly. But healthy adults in their prime years also died in great numbers, their strength offering no protection. Some families lost every member. Others saw half survive. There seemed to be no pattern, no way to predict who would live. Desperate for any measure that might help, Londoners turned to remedies that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. They carried posies of herbs and flowers, holding them to their noses to ward off corrupted air. They wore amulets inscribed with prayers or mystical symbols. They consumed ridiculous quantities of garlic and onions, believing these pungent foods would protect against infection. They avoided bathing, thinking that water opened the pores and allowed bad air to enter the body. They kept windows and doors sealed tight, trying to keep out the contagion, though this likely made transmission easier in households where one member had already fallen ill. Some remedies were actively harmful. The practice of bloodletting, removing blood to restore humoral balance, weakened patients who needed all their strength to fight the infection. Powerful purgatives that induced vomiting and diarrhea similarly sapped vital energy. Poultices applied to the bubo sometimes caused burns or secondary infections. The instinct to do something, anything, led to treatments that hastened death rather than prevented it. A few voices argued for isolation of the sick. If the plague spread through corrupted air, then perhaps keeping the sick separated from the healthy would slow its advance. Some households where plague appeared had doors marked with crosses, warning others to stay away. But enforcement was impossible. People needed food. They needed water. They needed someone to tend the sick and bury the dead. Complete isolation meant condemning entire families to die without aid. The city lacked both the resources and the will to impose such measures systematically. The plague's inexorable spread created an atmosphere of dread that was almost as destructive as the disease itself. People avoided one another, uncertain who might be carrying the infection. Markets became places of hasty, fearful transactions. Vendors and customers maintained distance, passing coins and goods at arm's length. Eye contact was avoided. Conversation was brief. The normal social interactions that bound communities together dissolved under the pressure of pervasive fear. Families turned inward, barring their doors against neighbours, trusting no one outside their immediate household. This isolation meant that when plague struck a family, they often suffered alone. No one came to help nurse the sick. No one brought food or water. In many cases, entire families died behind locked doors, their bodies discovered only days later when the smell became overwhelming, or when someone finally forced entry to investigate the silence. The poorest quarters of the city suffered most severely. In the crowded tenements along the Thames, where entire families occupied single rooms, where sanitation was primitive and people lived in conditions barely above animal squalor, the plague burned through the population like fire through dry kindling. These areas had always experienced higher death rates from disease. Infant mortality was extreme, illness was constant, but the plague exceeded anything that had come before. Entire buildings emptied. Lanes that had teemed with life fell silent. Bodies lay in the streets for days before anyone came to collect them. As November progressed and the death toll mounted, a new problem emerged. The city was running out of places to bury its dead. The parish churchyards, never large, had filled beyond capacity. Bodies were buried in every available space, packed so tightly that gravediggers had to be careful not to disturb the newly dead when interring fresh corpses. The earth in these small yards had become saturated with death, unable to absorb more. The church recognised that extraordinary measures were needed. The Bishop of London, consulting with the city authorities, arranged for the purchase of fields beyond the city walls. These would be consecrated as emergency burial grounds, places where the overflow of dead could be interred with at least minimal religious sanction. It was a practical solution to an overwhelming problem, but it meant abandoning the tradition of burial in parish churchyards, near the churches where people had worshipped, among the graves of their ancestors. It meant acknowledging that death had come on such a scale that the old ways of honouring the dead were no longer possible. Chapter 4. The Failure of Medicine. The Guild Hall of the Physicians stood in Knightrider Street, a stone building that spoke of the profession's prestige and lineage. Within its walls, the learned men who had studied at Bologna and Paris, who could read Latin and Greek, who owned precious manuscripts of Galen and Avicenna, met to discuss the crisis that was destroying their city and exposing the limitations of their art. The meetings, held by candlelight as November's darkness came early, grew smaller with each passing week as plague claimed members of their own guild. Master Geoffrey Rythe, a physician of 60 years who had served 3 generations of London families, stood before his remaining colleagues on a cold evening when sleet rattled against the hall's windows. His face, normally ruddy, had gone grey with exhaustion. He had attended 40 plague victims in the past month. 38 had died under his care. The 2 who survived and had recovered despite his treatments, not because of them. This reality haunted him. The physicians discussed theory with increasing desperation. If the plague arose from corrupted air, why did their usual remedies for aerial corruption fail? If it resulted from humoral imbalance, why did bloodletting and purging bring no improvement? If it was a fever of the blood, why did cooling remedies have no effect? They returned again and again to the same questions, arriving at no satisfactory answers. The texts they had studied, memorized, revered, offered no guidance for this particular calamity. One younger physician, recently returned from study in Montpellier, proposed a radical idea. Perhaps, he suggested, the plague was not primarily a humoral disorder at all. Perhaps it was caused by some form of contagion, some invisible corruption that passed from the sick to the healthy through direct contact. This would explain why those who attended plague victims so often fell ill themselves. It would explain why entire households succumbed while neighbours remained untouched. It suggested that avoidance, not treatment, was the only effective response. The older physicians rejected this theory as contrary to established medical doctrine. Contagion was a concept applied to leprosy, not to fevers and swellings. The young man was confusing separate categories of disease. Still, his words planted a seed of doubt. If contagion was the mechanism of spread, then physicians who attended the sick were placing themselves in mortal danger for no purpose. Their treatments helped no one and exposed them to certain death. It was a conclusion that called into question the very foundations of their calling. The apothecaries who prepared the medicines prescribed by physicians faced their own crisis of confidence. Their shops held hundreds of compounds, each carefully prepared according to ancient formulae. Theriac, the legendary cure-all that required 64 ingredients including viper's flesh, was reputed to counter any poison. Mithridatum, only slightly less complex, protected against venoms and pestilence. These preparations had been trusted for centuries. Now they failed completely. Patients who consumed theriac died at the same rate as those who received no treatment. One apothecary in Cheapside, a methodical man named Edmund Bray, began keeping records of every remedy he dispensed to plague victims and the outcomes that followed. He noted which patients received theriac, which received less expensive compounds, which received only simple herbs. He tracked who lived and who died. After treating 50 cases, he reviewed his notes and found no pattern. The survival rate was the same regardless of treatment. 5 survived out of 50. The other 45 died whether they received the most expensive theriac or the cheapest herbal tea. Bray shared his findings with other apothecaries at their guild meeting. The response was hostile. His records were dismissed as incomplete, his methodology as flawed. Some argued that perhaps his theriac was improperly prepared, that he had made some error in compounding. Others suggested that the 5 survivors proved the treatments worked, that without medicine all 50 would have died. But Bray, who had been an apothecary for 25 years, knew what his record showed. The medicines he had devoted his life to preparing were useless against the plague. The failure of conventional medicine created opportunities for those willing to exploit desperate fear. Charlatans appeared throughout the city, selling miracle cures and protective charms. A man calling himself Dr. Johannes claimed to possess a formula revealed to him in a vision by Saint Roch, the patron saint of plague victims. His elixir, sold in small vials for shocking prices, contained nothing more than wine infused with bitter herbs. It cured no one, but the desperate continued to buy it, clinging to any hope however false. Others sold amulets and talismans. A piece of parchment inscribed with mystical symbols guaranteed to ward off pestilence could be purchased for a week's wages. Dried toads to be worn around the neck. Powdered unicorn horn, actually ground narwhal tusk or horsebone. Mercury compounds that poisoned as much as any plague. The sick and the terrified spent their remaining coins on useless remedies, preferring the illusion of action to the horror of helpless waiting. The legitimate physicians, those who remained in London and continued their practices, found themselves competing with these frauds. But they could offer little more in terms of actual results. At least they charged reasonable fees and did not make extravagant promises. Yet even honest physicians struggled with the question of what they should charge for their services. The usual fees, negotiated based on the patient's status and the complexity of treatment, seemed inadequate given the danger of attending plague victims. Some physicians doubled or tripled their rates. Others continued to charge customary fees, believing that profiting from catastrophe was dishonourable. A few physicians abandoned fees entirely and worked for charity alone. These men, driven by religious conviction or simple compassion, moved through the poorest wards offering what comfort they could. They knew their treatments were ineffective. They knew they would likely die themselves, but they could not stand idle while others suffered. Their presence provided something more valuable than medicine. It offered human connection in a time when people died alone, abandoned by family and friends, too terrified to approach. One such physician, a man named Richard Cantle, who had trained at Cambridge, kept a journal during his months of charitable work in the eastern wards. His entries, written in careful Latin by candlelight after long days of making rounds, reveal both his dedication and his growing despair. Early entries describe patients methodically, noting symptoms and treatments. Later entries become more philosophical, questioning whether his work had any meaning. The final entry, dated in earlier December, breaks off mid-sentence. His body was found by a brother physician 3 days later. The monasteries and convents that maintained infirmaries faced catastrophic losses. The nursing brothers and sisters who tended the sick died in enormous numbers. At St. Bartholomew's Hospital, the largest infirmary in London, 3/4 of the staff perished between October and December. The hospital, which normally cared for the poor and indigent sick, could barely function. Patients lay unattended for hours. Food was distributed irregularly. The most basic nursing care, the changing of soiled linens, the provision of water, the comfort of human touch became impossible to maintain. The Benedictine monks at Westminster Abbey, living in their enclosed community, initially believed their separation from the city might protect them. They maintained their strict schedule of prayers and offices. They tended their gardens. They copied manuscripts in the scriptorium. But the plague penetrated even their walls. Perhaps it came with a servant who worked in the kitchens. Perhaps it arrived with a visiting priest. However it entered, once inside the community, it spread rapidly through the dormitories and chapter house. Within a month, half the brotherhood was dead. The abbot himself, a learned man who had overseen the abbey for 15 years, died in November. His death particularly grieved the community because of the manner of it. He suffered longer than most, the fever climbing and falling for 5 days before the final crisis. He remained conscious almost until the end, administering spiritual counsel to the monks who attended him even as his own body failed. His final words, recorded by the abbey's chronicler, were a prayer that God would remember mercy even in judgment. Medical knowledge passed orally from master to apprentice was being lost as physicians died without training successors. Techniques for compounding complex medicines, understanding of rare texts, experience accumulated over decades, all disappeared when the men who held this knowledge perished. The Guild of Physicians had maintained standards for generations, requiring years of university education, examination, and apprenticeship before granting the right to practice. Now, with so many qualified physicians dead or fled, untrained men began offering medical services. Former barber surgeons, accustomed to pulling teeth and setting bones, claimed competence to treat internal diseases. Herbalists who had never studied formal medicine prescribed treatments. These standards that had defined the profession for centuries collapsed under pressure. The barber surgeons, organised in their own guilds separate from the physicians, suffered equally devastating losses. These men performed the manual work of medicine, the bloodletting, tooth extraction, wound, treatment, and amputations that university-trained physicians considered beneath their station. In the crisis of the plague, this division of labour proved meaningless. Sick people needed help, whether from physicians or barber surgeons or anyone who would attend them. The barber surgeons found themselves treating plague victims despite having no specific training for it. They died at even higher rates than physicians because their normal work already brought them into constant contact with blood and bodily fluids. One barber surgeon named Thomas Curtis, who maintained a shop in Cordwainer Street, developed a technique that seemed to help a few patients. When the buboes appeared, he would lance them with a sharp knife, draining the dark fluid and blood that had accumulated. The procedure was excruciating, and many patients died from shock or blood loss. But a handful survived, their fevers breaking after the buboes were drained. Curtis shared his technique with other barber surgeons. Some reported similar limited successes. Others found that lancing the buboes made no difference to outcomes, or seemed to hasten death. The question of whether to lance the buboes became a matter of debate among the medical community. Some physicians argued that draining the corruption allowed the body to begin restoring humoral balance. Others contended that the buboes should be left alone, that interfering with the body's natural processes was dangerous. In practice, most physicians and barber surgeons tried lancing in some cases and not in others, attempting to develop intuition about when the procedure might help. No clear pattern emerged. The plague seemed to kill or spare according to its own logic. As winter deepened and the plague showed no signs of abating, the remaining physicians gathered once more in their guild hall. Their number had shrunk dramatically. Where 30 men had met in October, now fewer than a dozen remained. They faced an impossible situation. Their treatments did not work. Their understanding of disease could not explain what they observed. The population they served was dying in numbers that exceeded anything in living memory, and they could do nothing to stop it. Master Geoffrey Rythe, now the senior physician still practicing in London, stood before his colleagues with a document he had prepared. It was a formal declaration to be submitted to the bishop and the city authorities, acknowledging the limitations of medical art in the face of this pestilence. The physicians could not cure the plague, they could not prevent it. The best advice they could offer was flight, though they themselves remained to care for those who could not leave. It was a devastating admission of failure, but Rythe argued it was necessary. False hope was cruel. The people deserved honesty about what medicine could and could not do. The document was debated, revised, and finally approved. It was copied in careful script and sent to the bishop's palace and the guild hall. The response from the authorities was silence. What could they say? The admission confirmed what everyone already knew. The physicians, like the priests and the government officials, were helpless before the plague. All the learning of the universities, all the accumulated wisdom of centuries, all the careful study of ancient texts meant nothing. The Black Death killed without respect for human knowledge, and humanity could only endure until it passed. Chapter 5. The Church's Response. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral rang out across London on a cold morning in late November, summoning the faithful to a mass of supplication. The great church, its spire rising higher than any structure in England, stood at the heart of the city's religious life. Within its vast stone nave, beneath vaulted ceilings that seemed to reach toward heaven itself, the Bishop of London prepared to address the crisis that had brought his city to its knees. Ralph Stratford, Bishop of London, was a man of considerable learning and political skill. He had served in his office for nearly 2 decades, navigating the complex relationships between church, crown and city. He had weathered disputes over taxation, conflicts with the monasteries, and the constant challenges of maintaining ecclesiastical authority in a prosperous and sometimes unruly city. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for the plague. Nothing in all his study of theology and canon law offered guidance for a catastrophe of this magnitude. The congregation that gathered for the Mass was smaller than it would have been in ordinary times, perhaps 1/3 of the cathedral's usual attendance. Those who came kept distance from one another, spreading themselves throughout the nave rather than pressing together as they normally would. They wore heavy cloaks despite the interior's relative warmth, and many held pomanders or bundles of herbs to their faces. The fear was palpable, a presence as real as the incense smoke that rose from the censers. Bishop Stratford processed to the altar with his full retinue of priests and deacons, their vestments bright against the grey stone. The ritual unfolded with familiar precision. The Latin prayers rose and fell in ancient rhythms. The consecration of bread and wine, the transformation of earthly substances into the body and blood of Christ, proceeded as it had for centuries. In the midst of chaos and death, the Mass remained unchanging, an anchor of permanence in a world coming apart. After the communion, the bishop ascended to the pulpit to deliver his sermon. His voice, trained by years of preaching, carried to the farthest corners of the cathedral. He spoke of suffering and sin, of divine judgment and the need for repentance. The plague, he declared, was the scourge of God, sent to punish a world that had turned away from righteousness. London, like all of Christendom, had grown fat with prosperity and pride. The people had forgotten humility. They had pursued wealth and pleasure while neglecting prayer and charity. Now God had sent this terrible reminder of human mortality and the wages of sin. The bishop's words reflected orthodox theological understanding of disease and disaster. Since the time of the early church fathers, pestilence had been interpreted as divine punishment. The plagues of Egypt, the destruction of Sodom, the suffering of Job, all testified to God's willingness to afflict humanity when it strayed from the path of righteousness. This framework made sense of otherwise senseless suffering. It provided explanation and meaning. If the plague was punishment for sin, then repentance offered hope of deliverance. Bishop Stratford called upon his flock to examine their consciences, to confess their sins, and to amend their lives. He urged increased prayer, more frequent attendance at Mass, greater charity toward the poor. He announced that special processions would be organised, in which the faithful would march through the streets carrying crosses and relics, singing psalms and seeking God's mercy. These processions had been used before during times of crisis. They demonstrated collective piety, visible repentance, a community united in supplication. The first procession took place on the Feast of St. Andrew, the last day of November. Hundreds of Londoners gathered at St. Paul's in the grey light of early morning. They formed a long column that wound through the city streets, priests at the front bearing a great wooden cross, followed by monks and friars chanting psalms, then the lay faithful in their everyday clothes. Many went barefoot despite the cold, a sign of humility and penance. Some wore only thin shifts, deliberately embracing discomfort as a form of mortification. A few flagellated themselves with small whips, drawing blood that stained their clothing. The procession moved slowly through Cheapside and along the walls toward Aldgate, then back through the eastern wards to return to the cathedral. The route took them past shuttered shops and silent houses, past churchyards where fresh earth marked new graves, past entire streets where no one appeared in doorways or windows. The psalms they sang, ancient Hebrew poetry translated into Latin, spoke of affliction and deliverance, of crying out from the depths, of trusting in God's mercy even in the darkest valley. Not everyone approved of these public demonstrations of piety. Some physicians argued that gathering large crowds increased the risk of contagion, that the corrupted air would be more dangerous where many people pressed together. Some civic authorities worried about public order, about the potential for religious fervour to slip into chaos, but the church held that spiritual remedies were more important than physical precautions. If the plague was divine punishment, then only divine mercy could end it, and that mercy must be sought through prayer and penance. The processions became a regular feature of life in plague-stricken London. They occurred weekly, sometimes more frequently when death spiked. The participants changed as plague claimed some and fear kept others away, but there were always those desperate enough or faithful enough to join. These public prayers offered something that private devotion could not, a sense of community action, of collective effort to appease an angry God. In a time when people increasingly isolated themselves, when families barricaded themselves in their homes and neighbour avoided neighbour, the processions created temporary bonds of shared purpose. The parish priests who served London's 100 churches bore the heaviest burden of the church's response. These men, many of them poorly educated and modestly compensated, ministered directly to the people in their daily struggles with disease and death. When a family fell ill, they sent for the parish priest. He came to hear confessions, to administer the sacrament of extreme unction, to provide what comfort theology and ritual could offer. This meant entering houses where infection festered, breathing air thick with the smell of sickness, touching bodies covered in plague sores. The death rate among parish priests was catastrophic. In some parishes, 3 or 4 priests died in succession, each replacement surviving only days or weeks before succumbing himself. The church struggled to fill these vacancies. Priests from rural parishes were ordered to London to serve the decimated city churches. Many came reluctantly, knowing they faced probable death. Some refused outright, preferring ecclesiastical punishment to certain mortality. A few came willingly, viewing service in plague-stricken London as a form of martyrdom, an opportunity to demonstrate perfect Christian charity by laying down their lives for their flock. Father William Ravensby, priest of St Mary at Hill near Billingsgate, embodied this sacrificial dedication. He was a young man, barely 30, who had received his parish only 2 years before the plague arrived. When the pestilence struck his parish, he responded without hesitation. Every day he made rounds to the sick, bringing the sacraments, offering prayers, sitting with the dying so they would not face death alone. His parishioners, those who survived, later testified that he attended more than 100 plague victims in the space of 6 weeks. Father William kept a small journal, not of his own experiences, but of those he attended in their final hours, brief entries noting names, dates, final words if any were spoken. The journal reveals the routine of death that became his daily work. On November 15th, he attended 7 dying parishioners, on the 18th 9, on the 23rd 12. The entries grew shorter as the weeks passed, reduced to simple tallies. He was too exhausted for more. He died on December 2nd, found in the church by a parishioner who had come seeking his help. He had collapsed while preparing the altar for Mass. The journal was discovered in his rooms and eventually made its way to the bishop's archive. Not all clergy responded with such dedication. Some priests, particularly those serving wealthy parishes or holding multiple benefices, fled London as quickly as any merchant. They rationalised their departure in various ways. They were needed elsewhere. They would return when the danger passed. Their duty to preserve their own lives outweighed their duty to their parishioners. These departures were noted with bitterness by those left behind. What good was the church if its representatives abandoned the faithful in their greatest need? The monasteries and convents that dotted London faced their own spiritual crises. These communities had withdrawn from the world to dedicate themselves entirely to prayer and contemplation. Now the world's suffering penetrated their walls in the form of plague. The question arose, should they open their doors to care for the sick, or should they maintain their enclosure and focus on their primary calling of prayer? Different communities answered differently. The Franciscan friars, whose order emphasized poverty and service to the poor, threw themselves into caring for plague victims. Their house near Newgate became an informal hospital. The friars took in the sick who had nowhere else to go, the poor and homeless who would otherwise die in the streets. They provided what nursing care they could, which meant primarily making patients comfortable, giving them water, cleaning them when they soiled themselves, praying with them as death approached. The Franciscans died in extraordinary numbers. Of the 40 friars resident in the London house in September, only 7 remained alive by the new year. The Carthusian monks, who followed a stricter rule emphasizing silence and solitude, maintained their enclosure even as plague struck their house. Each monk lived in his own cell, emerging only for communal prayers. This isolation, intended as spiritual discipline, may have provided some protection against contagion. The Carthusians suffered fewer losses than more communal orders, but they also provided no direct care to the suffering city around them. Their response to the crisis was to intensify their prayers, to spend more hours in contemplation, to offer their suffering and fear as a spiritual sacrifice. Whether this was admirable devotion or selfish withdrawal depended on one's perspective. The convents of religious women faced particular difficulties. These communities, often drawn from the daughters of prosperous families, lived under strict enclosure. They had no experience of nursing the sick, no training in dealing with disease. When plague entered a convent, the sisters could do little but pray and watch each other die. At the Benedictine convent of St. Helens in Bishopsgate, 19 nuns died between October and January. The survivors, traumatized and diminished, struggled to maintain their offices and devotions. The rhythm of monastic life, which had seemed eternal, proved as fragile as individual human lives. The church's resources were stretched beyond capacity. The demand for funeral masses far exceeded what could be provided. Normally, each death would be marked with a requiem mass, sometimes multiple masses paid for by the family. Now, with dozens dying daily in each parish, individual funeral masses became impossible. Priests began celebrating collective requiems, blessing multiple bodies at once. The practice violated tradition and pained those who could afford proper funerals for their dead, but necessity demanded it. The sacrament of extreme unction, last rites, posed particular challenges. Church doctrine held that this sacrament should be administered to the dying by a priest, who would anoint them with holy oil and hear their final confession. But with so many dying and so few priests, individual attention became impossible. The bishop issued a dispensation allowing laymen to hear confessions in extremis. If no priest could be found, a dying person could confess to any baptized Christian, even a woman or child, and receive absolution. This extraordinary measure acknowledged that spiritual care of the dying took precedence over normal ecclesiastical order. The theology of suffering was debated in the scriptoriums and chapter houses where learned clergy gathered. Was the plague truly divine punishment? If so, why did it strike down the righteous as readily as sinners? Why did infants die, who could not yet have committed sin? Why did devout priests and monks perish while notorious sinners sometimes survived? These questions had no easy answers. Some theologians argued that the plague tested faith rather than punished sin, that God was refining his people through suffering as gold is refined in fire. Others suggested that the plague was permitted by God but caused by natural forces, that divine will and natural causation operated on different levels. Bishop Stratford issued a pastoral letter in December, intended to be read in every parish church in his diocese. The letter acknowledged the suffering of the people and the inadequacy of easy explanations. Yes, the plague was permitted by God. Yes, it called all to repentance. But it was not a simple equation where the wicked died and the righteous survived. God's ways were mysterious. Some righteous suffered while some wicked prospered in this life. True judgment awaited the next world. The proper response to plague was not to calculate who deserved to die, but to care for one another, to maintain faith, to trust in ultimate divine justice even when present circumstances seem to contradict it. The letter was well-reasoned and theologically sound. It provided as much comfort as theology could offer, but for families watching their children die, for individuals feeling fever begin its work in their own bodies, for communities seeing half their neighbours buried in mass graves, theological explanations rang hollow. The Church could name the plague as divine mystery. It could not explain why this particular suffering, this particular scale of death had been visited upon this generation. It could only counsel faith in the face of incomprehensible loss. As December wore on and deaths continued without abating, some began to question whether the Church's spiritual remedies had any effect. The processions had been held, the prayers said, the masses celebrated, the penances performed. Yet the plague raged on. Did this mean repentance was insufficient? Or did it mean the sins requiring punishment were so great that much more suffering was required? Or did it perhaps suggest that the plague had nothing to do with divine judgment at all? That it was simply a natural disaster that would run its course regardless of prayer? These questions were rarely voiced openly. To doubt the efficacy of prayer was to court accusations of heresy. To suggest the plague was not divine judgment was to undermine the Church's authority to interpret events. But in private conversations, in the doubts that surfaced in the dark hours before dawn, some began to wonder whether the frameworks they had been taught for understanding the world were adequate to explain what they were experiencing. The plague was teaching lessons, but they were not the lessons the Church's theology had prepared people to learn. Chapter 6. The Overwhelmed Graveyards. The churchyard of St. Bride's in Fleet Street had served its parish for 300 years. Generations of Londoners lay beneath its earth, their graves marked by simple stones or wooden crosses that weathered and decayed until the names became illegible and the dead passed into anonymous memory. The yard was not large, perhaps 40 paces by 30, enclosed by a low wall. Ancient yew trees stood at the corners, their dark foliage sheltering the ground beneath. It had always been a peaceful place, separated from the noise of Fleet Street by the church's bulk, a small rectangle of consecrated ground where the dead waited for resurrection. By December of 1348, no peace remained in St. Bride's churchyard. Every plot had been filled, then filled again. The sextons had long since abandoned any attempt to maintain separation between graves. They dug wherever space could be found, often striking the coffins or bodies of those buried weeks before. The ground had become sodden with decay, the earth dark and heavy, clinging to spades with a weight that spoke of corruption. The smell, even in winter's cold, was unmistakable. It hung over the yard like visible miasma, seeping into the church itself, permeating vestments and altar cloths. John Taverner, the sexton of St. Bride's, had held his position for 15 years. His father had been sexton before him, and his grandfather before that. The family had maintained the church and its yard for 3 generations, taking pride in their work. Taverner knew every corner of the churchyard, could point to graves of prominent parishioners, could recall funeral after funeral stretching back through his memory. He had thought he understood death, had thought the steady procession of mortality held no surprises for him. The plague had proven him wrong. On a morning in early December, Taverner stood at the edge of a pit he had just completed digging. It was 8 feet deep, ways wider than a normal grave, and when he climbed out, his arms shook with exhaustion. He was 42 years old, still strong, but the endless labour of digging graves in frozen ground was breaking him. This was the 37th grave he had prepared in the past month. Tomorrow he would dig another, and another the day after. There was no end in sight. Father Peter, the priest of St. Bride's, emerged from the church as the first funeral procession arrived. There were no mourners, only a cart driven by a man who kept a cloth wrapped around his face and would not meet anyone's eyes. 3 bodies lay in the cart bed, wrapped in shrouds of cheap linen. A family, Taverner supposed. Father, mother, child, or perhaps master, wife, servant. It no longer mattered. They would go into the ground together, blessed together, committed to earth and to God's mercy in a ritual that had been compressed to its bare essentials. Father Peter spoke the prayers in Latin, his voice tired but steady. He had performed this abbreviated funeral rite 43 times in the past 2 weeks. The words had lost their individual meaning and become simply sounds, holy sounds that fulfilled the church's obligation to the dead but could carry no emotional weight. How could they? There were too many dead, too many graves, too much loss for grief to maintain its proper intensity. Sorrow had become chronic, a permanent condition rather than an acute response. Taverner and an assistant, a boy of 16 who worked for pennies and the promise of learning a trade, lowered the bodies into the pit. They went down without ceremony, the shrouds already stained from the leaking fluids of decay. Father Peter sprinkled holy water, made the sign of the cross, and turned back toward the church. He had 2 more funerals scheduled before noon. The cart driver departed without a word. Taverner and his assistant began filling in the grave. As they worked, another cart appeared at the churchyard gate, then another. By midday, 5 bodies awaited burial, and Taverner had not yet finished covering the first 3. He worked mechanically, his mind numb, trying not to think about what he was doing. The boy who assisted him had begun to weep quietly while he shoveled. Taverner did not tell him to stop. Let the boy weep if he could still feel enough to weep. Taverner himself had moved beyond tears into a state of exhausted endurance. The situation at St. Bride's was replicated in every parish churchyard in London. By late November, the bishops and civic authorities had been forced to acknowledge that the traditional burial grounds could not accommodate the plague's dead. The church had always maintained strict rules about burial. The dead must be interred in consecrated ground blessed by proper authority. They must be buried with Christian rites, laid to rest with prayers that commended their souls to God's mercy. The grave must be marked, the deceased name recorded in the parish register. These practices honoured the dead and maintained the social memory that bound communities together. The plague made such practices impossible. There were too many dead and too little consecrated ground. The parish churches, which had always managed burial within their small yards, found themselves overwhelmed. Bodies began to accumulate. Families kept their dead at home for days, waiting for space in the churchyard. Some, desperate and unauthorized, buried their dead in gardens or fields, violating both law and church doctrine. The social order that had governed death for centuries was disintegrating. The Bishop of London, recognizing the crisis, took emergency action. In late November, he negotiated with the city authorities and several wealthy donors to purchase fields beyond the city walls for use as emergency burial grounds. These fields would be hastily consecrated, blessed by the bishop himself, and designated specifically for plague victims. It was an unprecedented step, but necessity left no alternative. 2 sites were selected, one north of the city walls in Smithfield, where the horse markets were normally held, another east of the tower in Stepney. The Smithfield site was purchased by Ralph Stratford, the Bishop of London, using his own funds supplemented by donations from nobles and wealthy merchants. It was a flat field of perhaps 3 acres, open and exposed to wind. In ordinary times it would have been considered unsuitable for burial, too far from any church, lacking the shelter and dignity of a traditional churchyard. But these were not ordinary times. The field was consecrated in a ceremony attended by the bishop and a small group of clergy on the last day of November. Holy water was sprinkled at the 4 corners, prayers were said, the ground was declared suitable for Christian burial. The first graves in the Smithfield field were dug in early December. Initially, the gravediggers followed traditional practices, creating individual plots arranged in neat rows. Each body would have its own space, separated from others by a few feet of earth. But the dead arrived faster than individual graves could be prepared. Within days, the gravediggers adapted their approach. They began digging long trenches, 8 feet wide and 10 feet deep, running the length of the field. These trenches would hold multiple bodies, laid side by side and in layers. The technique of mass burial was not entirely new. After battles, the dead were sometimes interred in large pits by necessity. Sieges that resulted in mass starvation might end with communal graves. But never before in England had such methods been applied to the civilian population of a major city, buried not as victims of war, but as casualties of disease. The Smithfield Field became a vast necropolis, its trenches filling day by day with the dead of London's northern parishes. The work of burial in these mass graves fell to men who had nowhere else to work, who needed wages desperately enough to accept employment that everyone else fled. Some were criminals released from prison on condition they serve as gravediggers. Others were men so poor that the risk of death meant little compared to the certainty of starvation. They were paid better than most labourers, their wages reflecting the danger and horror of their work. Many died themselves within weeks of beginning their employment. Others survived through the winter, somehow avoiding infection despite constant exposure. The process developed a grim efficiency. Carts arrived throughout the day, some from individual parishes, others sent by civic authorities to collect bodies from houses where entire families had perished. The bodies, shrouded if the family could afford cloth or simply wrapped in whatever fabric was available, were unloaded at the edge of the current trench. Gravediggers, working in teams, placed them in the trench, arranging them as carefully as time permitted. When one layer was complete, a thin covering of earth was spread before the next layer began. Some trenches reached depths of 12 feet and held hundreds of bodies in layers, separated only by inches of soil. When a trench was filled to within a few feet of ground level, it was topped with earth and marked with a simple wooden cross. The gravediggers then began excavating the next trench, moving systematically across the field. By mid-December, nearly a third of the Smithfield Field had been used. At the current rate of death, the entire site would be full by spring. The scene at the Smithfield Field was one that haunted those who witnessed it. The open trenches, dark wounds in the frozen earth, the endless procession of carts, their burdens anonymous under stained shrouds. The gravediggers bent to their labour, their faces wrapped against the smell, their movements mechanical with exhaustion. The few clergy who came to bless the trenches, hurrying through their prayers before departing. It was a vision of death industrialised, reduced to logistics and a manual labour, stripped of individual dignity or significance. At night, the field was supposed to be empty, the work suspended until dawn. But people reported seeing lights moving among the trenches, hearing sounds that might have been prayers, or might have been something else. Thieves came after dark to rob the dead, cutting shrouds away to search for rings or coins that might have been buried with the bodies. These ghouls worked quickly, knowing that guards patrolled irregularly and that being caught meant hanging. They contributed another layer of horror to a place already saturated with death. The eastern burial ground in Stepney served the parishes near the tower and along the river. It was smaller than the Smithfield site, perhaps an acre and a half donated by the Abbey of St Mary Graces. The same pattern of mass burial developed there, though on a smaller scale. Long trenches, layers of bodies, perfunctory blessings. The Stepney site filled even faster than Smithfield because it served some of London's most densely populated wards, the neighbourhoods where plague burned hottest through crowded tenements and narrow lanes. Not everyone ended up in the consecrated fields. The very poor, those who died in the streets or in houses where no one remained alive to report the death, were sometimes buried in unmarked pits on unconsecrated ground. City workers, tasked with clearing bodies that posed a public health threat, dug trenches wherever convenient and filled them without ceremony or prayer. These burials violated church law and condemned the dead to lie outside the Christian community, unable to receive prayers for their souls. But in the chaos of December 1348, such considerations seemed abstract compared to the immediate necessity of removing corpses from the streets. Some wealthy families, determined that their dead should not end up in mass graves, made elaborate and expensive arrangements. They purchased plots in parish churchyards, paying exorbitant fees for space that was supposedly unavailable. They hired private gravediggers, offering wages far above the standard rate. They arranged for individual funeral masses, compensating priests who risked infection to provide traditional rites. These families could afford dignity for their dead, but even their resources had limits. When multiple family members died, Even the wealthy sometimes resorted to collective burials. The monasteries and cathedral chapters that owned their own burial grounds tried to maintain traditional practices for their members. When a monk or canon died, he would be interred in the cloister or chapter house according to the rites of his order. But as deaths multiplied, even these privileged institutions found their burial capacity exceeded. The chapter house of St. Paul's Cathedral, where canons had been buried for centuries, filled completely by December. Additional space had to be found in the cathedral's extensive grounds. Eventually, even the cathedral resorted to a form of mass burial, creating common graves for its clergy. The parish registers, which recorded births, deaths, and marriages, became documents of catastrophe. Priests who maintained these records with care, noting each death with the deceased's name and date, found themselves overwhelmed. The entries for November and December 1348 are dense with death, page after page of names, often with entire families listed in sequence. Some priests gave up trying to record individual deaths and instead noted only weekly totals. Others simply wrote for phrases like, "Many died this week," or "The pestilence raged." The registers, intended to preserve memory, became testimony to memory's failure in the face of mass death. John Taverner, the sexton of St. Bride's, managed to continue his work through December despite exhaustion and despair. He dug graves, maintained the church, assisted at funeral after funeral. He watched the churchyard that his family had tended for generations transform into something unrecognizable. The carefully maintained order replaced by desperate improvisation. On the morning of December 20th, he did not appear for work. His assistant, the boy who had wept while shoveling earth, went to Taverner's house and found him dead. The sexton's wife had died 3 days earlier. He had buried her himself at night in a corner of St. Bride's churchyard before returning home to die alone. The boy, whose name was Thomas Fletcher, became sexton by default. There was no one else. At 16 years old, he took on the responsibility of digging graves for his parish. He would continue that work through the winter and into the spring, would bury hundreds of his neighbours, would somehow survive when so many died. Years later, as an old man, he would tell his grandchildren about the winter of the plague, about the graveyards that overflowed, about the frozen ground that resisted the spade, about the bodies that kept coming with no end in sight. His grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, unable to imagine such horrors, unable to conceive of death on such a scale. But Thomas Fletcher would remember, would carry those memories until his own death, would be buried finally in the same churchyard of St. Bride's where he had worked as a boy during the worst winter London had ever known. Chapter 7. The Social Collapse. The markets of London had always been the city's beating heart, the places where commerce and community intersected, where goods changed hands and news circulated, where the machinery of urban life operated with the regularity of sunrise. Cheapside, the great central market street, had for centuries been lined with shops and stalls offering every commodity the medieval world produced. Goldsmiths displayed their craft in workshops with glass windows, a luxury that proclaimed their wealth. Mercers sold cloth from Flanders and Italy. Spicers offered pepper and cinnamon brought from the distant east. Bakers, fishmongers, poulterers, each trade had its designated area, its recognised place in the ordered geography of commerce. By December of 1348, Cheapside had fallen silent. The shops stood shuttered, their owners dead or fled. The stalls that had been set up each morning at dawn remained packed away. The crowds that had once jammed the street, housewives bargaining with vendors, servants running errands for their masters, apprentices delivering goods, merchants conducting their business, all had vanished. A person could walk the length of Cheapside at midday and he encounter perhaps a dozen others, all of them hurrying, heads down, avoiding contact or conversation. The great artery of London's commerce had become a deserted passage between empty buildings. The collapse of the markets created cascading shortages. Bread, the foundation of every Londoner's diet, became scarce as bakers died or ceased working. The complicated chain that brought grain from the countryside to the city mills, the mills to the bakeries to the consumers, had broken down at multiple points. Farmers were reluctant to bring their grain to a plague-stricken city. Mill workers had perished. Bakers who remained alive could not obtain flour or fuel for their ovens. The few bakeries still operating sold their loaves at prices that only the wealthy could afford. A loaf of bread that had cost a penny in September now cost 4p if it could be found at all. Families that had lived on bread and ale, supplemented with occasional cheese or vegetables, faced genuine hunger. Some turned to their neighbours, begging food from those whose pantries still held supplies. Others broke into abandoned houses, scavenging what had been left behind when the occupants died or fled. Theft became common in a city where normal social constraints were dissolving. There were too few watchmen to maintain order, and those who remained concentrated on more serious crimes. The fish market at Billingsgate, which had supplied London with fresh and salted fish for centuries, essentially ceased to function. The fishmongers who brought their catches up the Thames found fewer buyers with each passing week. Some fish rotted at the docks, no one available to purchase or distribute it. The smell of decaying fish added to the general stench that pervaded the riverside areas. Eventually, many fishmongers simply stopped coming to London. They sold their catches in smaller towns along the coast, places where plague had not yet struck or had struck less severely. London, always dependent on the goods brought from elsewhere, found its supply lines severed. The butchers of the Shambles, the district east of Newgate where animals were slaughtered and their meat sold, struggled to continue their trade. The work of butchering required strong men with specialised skills. As these men died, their apprentices and journeymen were supposed to step up, continue the trade, maintain the supply of meat. But many apprentices had fled. Others had died. The guild structure that normally regulated the meat trade, ensuring quality and fair prices, had collapsed. Those butchers who remained could charge whatever they wished, and what they wished was enough to compensate for the risk of working in a city of death. The brewers and alewives who provided the small beer that Londoners drank with every meal, the weak ale that was safer than water and necessary for daily sustenance, found their operations disrupted. Brewing required grain, which was scarce. It required clean water, which was always problematic in London, but became more so as a fewer workers maintained the public wells and fountains. It required labour, the carrying of heavy barrels, the management of fermentation, the distribution to alehouses and private customers. As plague killed workers, the supply of beer and ale diminished. People began drinking water again, despite knowing it often made them sick with other ailments. There was no choice. The guilds that had governed London's trades for centuries found themselves unable to maintain their traditional functions. Each guild had its hierarchy, its rules, its standards that members were required to meet. Apprentices served for 7 years before becoming journeymen. Journeymen worked under masters until they could produce a masterwork that demonstrated their skill, at which point they might be admitted to the guild as masters themselves. This system had preserved craft knowledge and maintained quality for generations. The plague destroyed it in months. The Mercers' Company, one of the wealthiest and most prestigious guilds, lost more than half its membership between September and January. Masters died, leaving their apprentices without guidance. Workshops closed, leaving journeymen unemployed. The complicated network of relationships, the mutual obligations and hierarchies that had structured the trade, simply dissolved. Those who survived found themselves making decisions they were not qualified to make, taking on responsibilities they had never expected to bear. Young men of 20 found themselves managing businesses that should have been inherited by their masters' sons, except the sons were dead. The goldsmith work that had been Cheapside's particular glory, the delicate craftsmanship that produced chalices for churches, jewellery for nobles, ornate vessels for wealthy merchants, essentially stopped. The goldsmiths had been a small, exclusive group, their skills refined over lifetimes of practice. When plague killed the master craftsmen, their knowledge died with them. The apprentices who survived lacked the experience to work gold to the same standard. Some tried and produced inferior work, others simply abandoned the trade, selling off their master's tools and stock, seeking easier employments. A craft tradition that had taken centuries to develop was crippled in a season. The city government, which in normal times provided at least minimal oversight of public services, could barely function. The mayor and aldermen who governed London's 25 wards met with increasing irregularity as death claimed their members. The complex committee structure that managed everything from street cleaning to law enforcement to tax collection to market regulation had been designed for normal times. It required regular meetings, recorded decisions, coordinated action across multiple wards. In the chaos of plague, such bureaucracy was impossible. The most basic public services failed. Street cleaning, never adequate, even in the best of times, ceased almost entirely. The rakers who were supposed to clear refuse from the streets and haul it to dumps outside the city walls had mostly died or fled. Garbage accumulated in piles that grew higher each week. Dead animals lay where they fell. The drainage ditches that were supposed to carry waste toward the Thames became clogged with refuse and filth. The city, always malodorous, became truly foul. The smell of decay was everywhere, impossible to escape. The public wells and fountains that supplied water to neighbour Kidder without direct access to the Thames required constant maintenance. Pipes leaked. Cisterns needed cleaning. The wooden housings around wellheads rotted and required repair. In the absence of workers to maintain this infrastructure, the water supply deteriorated. Some wells ran dry because broken pipes diverted water elsewhere. Others became contaminated with seepage from cesspits or the general filth that covered the streets. People drank bad water and suffered from various ailments in addition to plague. The watch, the citizens assigned to patrol the streets at night maintaining order and watching for fire, was supposed to be a duty shared by all householders. In practice, the wealthy paid substitutes, poor men who needed the small payment and were willing to walk the dark streets. Now even these substitute watchmen had disappeared. Some were dead, others simply failed to show up for duty, preferring to remain barricaded in their homes. The nights were left largely unwatched. Houses burned without alarm being raised. Criminals operated with impunity. The normal assumption that morning would bring witnesses and consequences no longer held. Crime increased as social controls weakened. Theft was most common, breaking into houses that appeared abandoned, taking whatever could be carried off. Food was a primary target, but thieves also stole clothing, tools, household goods, anything with value. Some theft was motivated by genuine need. People stealing to survive. Other theft was opportunistic, taking advantage of a situation where almost no one would be caught or punished. The distinction perhaps mattered philosophically, but made no practical difference to the victims. Violence, though less common than theft, did occur. Disputes that in normal times would have been settled through legal processes or mediation sometimes erupted into bloodshed. With fewer authorities to intervene, with the normal expectation of consequences removed, some men gave into anger or fear and struck out at neighbours or strangers. There were killings over food, over space in the markets, over accusations that someone had spread the plague deliberately. The city's coroners, who were supposed to investigate all sudden deaths, could not keep up with the volume. Most deaths, whether from plague or violence, went unexamined. Family structures, the fundamental units of medieval society, came under terrible strain. When plague struck a household, decisions had to be made. Would healthy members remain to care for the sick, knowing they would likely become infected themselves? Or would they flee, abandoning sick family members to save themselves? There was no good answer. Both choices carried moral weight and practical consequences. Those who stayed often died. Those who fled lived with guilt and social stigma, though in the general chaos such stigma might matter less than it would have in normal times. Children were left orphaned in extraordinary numbers. When both parents died, the traditional response would be for extended family to take in the children, or for the parish to arrange care. But extended families were themselves devastated. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, all the kinship networks that normally provided safety nets were shredded by plague. The parishes, overwhelmed with caring for the dying and burying the dead, had no resources for organising childcare. Orphans wandered the streets, begging, stealing, banding together for survival. Some were taken in by sympathetic neighbours, others simply disappeared, victims of cold or hunger or disease. The elderly, who in normal times would be cared for by their children, found themselves alone. Their children had died, or their children had fled, leaving the old to fend for themselves. Some neighbours provided help, bringing food, checking on the isolated elderly. But many old people simply died alone, their bodies discovered days or weeks later when the smell became noticeable. The care of the elderly, like so many other social obligations, was a casualty of the general collapse of community bonds. Marriage plans were abandoned. Young couples who had been betrothed delayed their weddings indefinitely, waiting for the plague to pass. Some went ahead with hurried ceremonies, trying to grasp at happiness before death claimed them. The traditional elaborate weddings, with their feasts and celebrations, their gathering of extended families, became impossible. People married quietly if they married at all, often with only a priest and perhaps one or two witnesses present. The social ritual that bound families together and created alliances between households was reduced to its bare legal minimum. The apprenticeship system, which provided training for the next generation of craftsmen, broke down completely. Masters died before their apprentices completed training. Apprentices ran away, no longer bound by contracts that death had voided. The careful transmission of skills from one generation to the next, the foundation of guildcraft, was interrupted. Knowledge that should have been passed on was lost. Techniques that had been refined over centuries were forgotten when the men who knew them died without teaching others. Servants, who formed a large portion of London's population, found their situations transformed. Some servants remained loyal to their employers, continuing to work even as households fell apart around them. These loyal servants often died alongside the families they served. Other servants fled at the first sign of plague, breaking their bonds of service to seek safety. Some found themselves the only survivors of households where master, mistress, and children had all perished. These servants, technically freed by their employers' deaths, might inherit the household or might be evicted by distant relatives who claimed the property. The social hierarchy that had structured medieval society showed signs of instability. The assumption that nobles were noble, that masters deserved mastery, that the social order reflected divine will, became harder to maintain when high and low died indiscriminately. A scullery maid might survive while the lady she served perished. An apprentice might live while his master died. These random survivals suggested that perhaps the social order was not as firmly grounded in cosmic justice as the church and nobility claimed. Such thoughts were dangerous, potentially revolutionary, though in December of 1348 most people were too concerned with immediate survival to contemplate social philosophy. The city's population, which had been approximately 50,000 in September, had diminished by perhaps a third by the end of December. 15,000 dead or fled in 3 months. The loss was not evenly distributed. Some parishes in the crowded eastern wards had lost half their population. Some wealthier western parishes had lost fewer, protected somewhat by larger houses, more resources, better nutrition. But no area was spared entirely. Every ward, every parish, every street had its empty houses, its abbreviated families, its missing members. London in December of 1348 was a city that had lost the ability to function as a city. The market economy had collapsed. The guild system had been crippled. The government operated intermittently at best. The most basic public services had ceased. What remained was a collection of isolated households, each trying to survive, each hoping the plague would pass, each waiting for a return to normalcy that seemed increasingly impossible to imagine. The social fabric that made urban life possible had been torn apart. Whether it could be repaired, whether London could recover, whether the city had any future at all, remained uncertain as winter deepened, and the dying continued without end. Chapter 8. The Mass Graves. The field at Smithfield, which had been purchased in November and consecrated by the Bishop of London for emergency burials, had by late December become a landscape that seemed to exist outside normal human experience. The flat ground that had once supported grazing horses and hosted market fairs was now scarred by long trenches, some filled and covered, others gaping open, waiting for their next burden of bodies. The earth itself had changed character, dark and heavy, saturated with the fluids of decay, refusing to freeze despite the winter cold. William Cosinor had been a gravedigger at Smithfield for 6 weeks. He was a man of 35 who had worked as a labourer on the docks before plague destroyed that employment. With no ships arriving, no cargo to unload, Cosin had faced starvation. The job of gravedigger, which paid 3 times the normal labourer's wage, was his only option. He knew it would probably kill him. Most gravediggers survived only a few weeks before succumbing to plague. But 3 weeks of good wages meant his wife and children might eat through the winter, even if he died. It was a calculation many men made in those months, trading their lives for their family's survival. The work began before dawn and continued until darkness made digging impossible. Cosin and the other grave diggers, usually 6 or 8 men working together, would arrive at the field to find carts already waiting. The bodies came from parishes across northern London, collected during the night, delivered to Smithfield by drivers who were themselves often dying. The gravediggers would drag the bodies from the carts, still wrapped in their shrouds if they had shrouds, naked if they did not, and arrange them in the current trench. The technique had evolved through trial and error. At first, the gravediggers had tried to lay the bodies out carefully, arranging them side by side, leaving space between them, but the sheer number made such care impossible. Now they packed the bodies as tightly as they would fit, one against another, filling every inch of the trench's bottom before beginning a second layer. A thin covering of lime was spread across each layer, both to speed decomposition and to reduce the smell. Then more bodies, then more lime, layer upon layer until the trench was filled. The work required a kind of brutal efficiency that transformed the gravediggers themselves. They developed a hardness, an emotional callousness that was necessary for psychological survival. They no longer saw the bodies as people who had been alive days before, who had names and families and histories. The bodies became objects to be moved, arranged, buried. Any other perspective would have been unbearable. A few gravediggers broke under the psychological strain, simply walking away from the work mid-shift, wandering off into the city, sometimes found days later raving or dead from self-inflicted wounds. Cosin had learned to work without thinking. He would grasp a body by the ankles, another gravedigger would take the shoulders, and together they would swing it down into the trench. The body landed with a dull sound, flesh on flesh or flesh on earth. Then the next body and the next. Sometimes a shroud would come loose and he would see a face, eyes open or closed, mouth twisted in the final agony of death. He trained himself not to look at faces. Hands and feet were enough. They were all the same in the end. The physical labour was punishing. The trenches were 10 feet deep and the gravediggers had to climb in and out constantly, positioning bodies, spreading lime, climbing out for more bodies. The earth was heavy and cold when it rained, which it did frequently, the trenches filled with water that had to be bailed out before work could continue. The gravediggers were constantly wet, constantly cold, their hands cracked and bleeding, their backs aching from the endless bending and lifting. The smell was beyond description. It was a physical presence, thick and cloying, invading nose and mouth and lungs. The smell of decay, of body fluids, of lime, of earth soaked with corruption. The gravediggers wrapped cloths around their faces, soaked the cloths in vinegar or rosemary oil, but nothing truly helped. The smell penetrated everything, clung to hair and clothing, seemed to seep into the skin itself. Cosin would return home each evening and his wife would make him strip outside the house, would wash his clothes separately from the family's other laundry, but still the smell lingered. His children learned to recognize their father by that smell, the scent of death that he carried with him. The scale of burial at Smithfield defied comprehension. In the first month of operation, the field received approximately 3,000 bodies. By late December, the number had climbed past 5,000. The trenches marched across the field in neat parallel lines, each one filled with hundreds of dead. A person standing at the field's edge could see the geography of death laid out systematically, an enormous exercise in logistics, a response to catastrophe that reduced human beings to units to be processed and stored. Not everyone who died in London came to Smithfield. The field served primarily the northern parishes. Other emergency burial grounds served other areas. The Stepney field east of the city received bodies from the riverside wards. A smaller field south of the Thames served Suffolk. The parish churchyards continued to receive some dead, those whose families could pay for traditional burial. But Smithfield, by virtue of its size and central location, became the primary repository for London's plague dead, the place where the majority of those who died between November and February were laid to rest. The church attempted to maintain minimal religious standards at the mass burial grounds. A priest was supposed to be present to bless the bodies as they were interred. In practice, this rarely happened. The priests who came to Smithfield would arrive once or twice a day, would bless whatever bodies had accumulated since their last visit, and would depart quickly. The blessing was spoken over the groups of 20 or 30 bodies at once, a collective prayer that acknowledged the dead's Christian identity while making no pretense of individual attention. It was better than nothing, but barely. Some families made efforts to ensure their dead received at least minimal religious care. They would follow the cart to Smithfield, would stand at the edge of the current trench while their father or mother or child was placed in the ground. They would pray quietly, would make the sign of the cross, would perhaps drop a handful of earths on the shroud. Then they would turn and walk back to the city, leaving their dead in a mass grave with hundreds of strangers. It was all that could be done. The plague had stripped away the elaborate rituals of death that had given comfort and meaning to loss. What remained was this, a quick prayer and a long walk home. The gravediggers noticed patterns in what arrived at Smithfield. Some days brought mostly adults, other days brought many children. Tiny bodies wrapped in cloths that seemed obscenely small. Sometimes entire families arrived together, their shrouds tied with the same rope, indicating they had died in the same house and been collected together. The gravediggers would place family groups side by side when possible, a small gesture toward maintaining relationships even in death. But with the volume of bodies, such considerations were luxuries that time did not always permit. Theft from the dead was a persistent problem. Despite the presence of gravediggers and occasional patrols by City Watch, thieves would come to Smithfield at night. They would pry up the earth that covered newly filled trenches, would cut open shrouds, would search bodies for rings or coins or any item of value that might have been buried with the dead. The theft of grave goods was a crime punishable by hanging, but enforcement was almost impossible. The thieves worked quickly and disappeared into the darkness. By morning, the disturbed earth would be noticed and covered again, but the damage was done. One night in mid-December, William Cossin remained at Smithfield after dark. He had fallen behind in his work. A trench needed to be finished before morning when more bodies would arrive. He worked by lantern light, alone in the field, surrounded by trenches full of the dead. The experience affected him profoundly. He heard sounds he could not explain, movements in the darkness beyond his lantern's circle. He told himself it was wind, or animals, or his own exhaustion creating phantoms. But the field felt haunted, felt as though the thousands buried there were not entirely absent, as though something of them lingered in the cold air and disturbed earth. After that night, Kazin insisted on leaving Smithfield before dark. He would abandon unfinished work rather than remain after sunset. The other gravediggers understood. They all felt it, the oppressive sense of wrongness that hung over the field. Humans were not meant to bury thousands of their fellows in pits. Communities were not meant to see half their members disappear into the earth within a few months. The field at Smithfield had become a wound in the fabric of normal life, a place where the sheer scale of death had created something unnatural. As December progressed toward January, the rate of death began to show signs of slowing. Where 50 or 60 bodies had Arrived at Smithfield each day in early December, the number dropped to 40, then 30. The decrease was gradual and uncertain. One day would see fewer deaths, the next would spike again. But the overall trend suggested that perhaps the plague's fury was beginning to exhaust itself. The gravediggers allowed themselves to hope that the worst might be passing. William Cousin survived his weeks as a gravedigger, one of the few to do so. He would work at Smithfield until February, when the last trenches were filled and the field was finally closed to new burials. In those months, he participated in the interment of more than 6,000 people, perhaps 10% of London's entire population. He would carry memories of that winter for the rest of his life, would wake sometimes in the night with the smell of lime and decay in his nostrils, would see in dreams the endless procession of carts and bodies and open trenches that had been his daily reality. The field at Smithfield would remain consecrated ground, a mass cemetery that the church and city authorities agreed should be left undisturbed. For years afterward, the field remained open and empty, the disturbed earth gradually settling, grass growing over the filled trenches. No marker indicated what lay beneath. No list recorded the names of the dead. They were anonymous, their individual identities lost, remembered only as victims of the great mortality that had swept through London in the winter of 1348. Centuries later, when London had grown and buildings had covered every available space, people would occasionally disturb the mass graves of Smithfield. Construction projects would break through into the old burial trenches. Workers would uncover bones in quantities that shocked even those familiar with the plague's history. The bones were jumbled, mixed together, impossible to separate or identify. They testified to the catastrophe that had been to the moment when London's normal ways of honouring the dead had collapsed under the weight of overwhelming mortality. The graves at Smithfield were silent witnesses, preserving in earth and bone the memory of the winter when death came to London on a scale the city had never before experienced, and would, God willing, never experience again. Chapter 9. The Slow Retreat. February came to London with snow that fell in heavy, wet flakes, covering the scarred earth of the burial fields, blanketing the empty streets, muffling the reduced sounds of a diminished city. The snow was clean and white, a temporary veil over the contamination and corruption that had marked the preceding months. For a few days, while the snow lasted, London looked almost peaceful, almost normal, until one noticed the lack of smoke from chimneys, the absence of tracks between buildings, the silence where there should have been the noise of human activity. The plague had not stopped. Bodies still arrived at the burial grounds each day. Families still woke to find members fevered and swelling with the characteristic buboes. Death continued its work through February and into March, but something had changed. The desperate, overwhelming surge of mortality that had characterized November and December had diminished. Where 100 people had died daily across London's parishes in the worst weeks, now perhaps 30 or 40 died each day. It was still terrible. It still exceeded normal mortality by many times. But it was not the apocalyptic flood that had threatened to drown the city entirely. People began to cautiously hope. Perhaps the worst had passed. Perhaps the plague was burning itself out, having killed all those susceptible to it and leaving the survivors with some kind of resistance. Perhaps God's anger was abating, satisfied by the suffering already inflicted. Perhaps spring, when it came, would bring an end to the dying. These hopes were voiced quietly, tentatively, with the understanding that presuming too much might invite renewed catastrophe. But they were voiced nonetheless, because humans need hope to continue living. The parish of St. Stephen Walbrook in the heart of the city had lost nearly half its population between October and January. The church's registers recorded death after death, page after page of names, entire families erased. Father Thomas, the priest who had served the parish for 12 years, had survived despite attending hundreds of dying parishioners. He could not explain his survival except as divine will. So many had died, so many whom he had known since childhood, whom he had baptized or married or heard in confession. Their absence was a physical presence in his church, an emptiness that filled the nave when he celebrated Mass. On the first Sunday of February, Father Thomas looked out at his congregation and counted perhaps 30 people in a church that normally held 200. The survivors sat scattered through the nave, maintaining distance from one another even though the visible signs of plague had diminished. They sang the familiar hymns in thin voices that echoed strangely in the half-empty space. Father Thomas preached about endurance, about faith tested and maintained, about the patience required to wait for God's mercy. He did not promise that the plague was over. He promised only that they would continue, that the parish would survive, that life would eventually resume. The slow retreat of the plague allowed some normal activities to cautiously restart. The markets began to show signs of life. A few vendors returned to Cheapside, setting up stalls with what goods they could obtain. Bread was available again, though expensive. Some fish arrived at Billingsgate. A trickle of supplies from the countryside began reaching the city as farmers grew less afraid to approach London. The commercial life that had been the city's foundation began to stir, weakly and tentatively, but perceptibly. The guilds attempted to reorganise themselves. The surviving masters of each trade met to assess the damage and plan recovery. The Mercers' Company found that of 47 masters who had been active in September, only 19 remained alive. The guild's hall, which had been closed since November, was reopened. Records were reviewed. Outstanding debts were settled. The complex business of determining who had died, who had fled, who remained, what properties were abandoned, what apprenticeships were interrupted, all this administrative work began slowly. The process of rebuilding commercial operations revealed the depth of the disruption. Many workshops lacked masters or journeymen with sufficient skill to maintain production. Supplies that would normally have been available were scarce. The networks of credit and obligation that had facilitated trade were broken. Partners dead. Contracts voided. Trust destroyed. The guilds made provisions for apprentices to complete their training under new masters. They waived some requirements, shortened some terms, made exceptions that would have been unthinkable before the plague. The priority was survival, maintaining enough skilled workers to keep trades functioning. Some enterprising individuals saw opportunity in the disaster. Properties were available at low prices, their owners dead without heirs or desperate to sell and leave the city. Workshops could be purchased cheaply. A young man with a little capital and ambition could establish himself as a master craftsman in months rather than years. The social fluidity that the plague created, the sudden availability of positions that would normally have taken decades to reach, benefited some survivors even as it disturbed traditional hierarchies. The city government slowly reconstituted itself. The mayor and aldermen who remained alive began meeting regularly again in February. They faced enormous tasks. The city's finances were in chaos. Tax collection had essentially stopped during the worst months. Public debts had accumulated. At the same time, revenues had collapsed as trade diminished. The government needed to restore basic services, street cleaning, water supply, law enforcement, but lacked resources to pay workers. Solutions were improvised. Taxes were levied on survivors at rates higher than before. Some services were contracted to private individuals who would work for the right to keep a portion of fees collected. The law courts, which had closed in November, reopened in March. The backlog of cases was enormous. Disputes over property, inheritance, contracts, debts, all had accumulated during the months when legal processes were suspended. Many cases were complicated by deaths. A plaintiff or defendant had died. Witnesses had died. Documents had been lost when houses were abandoned. The judges struggled to sort through the tangled affairs of the dead, trying to render justice when so much of the evidence had disappeared with those who had perished. Inheritance law had not been designed for a situation where entire families died within days of each other. The normal rules assumed that deaths occurred one at a time, with clear succession. When a father, mother, and all children died within a week, who inherited? If it could be determined who died first, the property would pass through each death until reaching a living heir. perhaps a distant cousin. But often the order of deaths was unclear. Bodies had been found together, impossible to determine who died first. The courts made rulings based on presumptions and precedents that barely fit the circumstances. Women found their situations transformed in unexpected ways. A widow whose husband died of plague inherited his property and business. Normally, she would be expected to remarry quickly, bringing the property under a new husband's control. But with so many men dead, the supply of suitable husbands was limited. Some widows chose to remain unmarried, managing their businesses themselves. This was unusual but increasingly accepted. The plague had created a shortage of labour and expertise so severe that anyone capable of running a workshop or managing a trade was needed. Gender restrictions that would normally have prevented women from guild membership were quietly relaxed. Children who had been orphaned began to emerge from wherever they had sheltered during the worst months. Some had been taken in by neighbours or distant relatives. Others had survived on the street through begging or theft. The parish authorities and what remained of extended families tried to provide for these orphans, but resources were limited. Many children were apprenticed out younger than normal, bound to masters who needed workers and were willing to take untrained children. The quality of such apprenticeships varied greatly. Some masters were kind and responsible, others were brutal, viewing orphan apprentices as free labour to be exploited. The church worked to restore its institutional presence. Parishes that had lost their priests received new assignments, often young men who had just completed their education, thrown into positions of responsibility before they were ready. The monasteries and convents that had been devastated by plague began accepting new novices, rebuilding their numbers. The process would take years. Some religious houses never fully recovered, their numbers too diminished, their resources too depleted to sustain the regular life of prayer and work that had been their purpose. Bishop Ralph Stratford issued a pastoral letter in March addressing the diocese's survival. He acknowledged the terrible losses, the thousands who had died, the breakdown of normal religious life during the worst months. He praised those priests who had remained at their posts, who had died attending the sick. He urged the survivors to rebuild, to maintain faith, to trust that God's purposes, though mysterious, were ultimately just. The letter was more hopeful than his earlier communications had been. The very act of thinking about reconstruction implied that the immediate crisis was passing. The city's physical appearance bore testimony to what had occurred. Entire streets were lined with houses that showed no signs of habitation. Doors remained barred, shutters closed, weeds growing in doorways. Some houses had been looted, their contents scattered or stolen. Others remained untouched, their interiors exactly as their occupants had left them when they died or fled. These empty houses became a problem. They attracted squatters and criminals. They deteriorated from lack of maintenance. The city authorities eventually organised efforts to identify the owners or heirs, to settle ownership, to bring the properties back into use. The burial grounds, established during the plague, remained full. Smithfield and the other emergency sites were closed to new burials by March, their trenches filled and covered. The city arranged for the sites to be maintained as consecrated ground. Grass was planted over the disturbed earth. Low fences were erected to mark the boundaries. There was discussion of erecting monuments, some kind of permanent marker to identify what lay beneath and honour the thousands buried there. But the survivors had limited resources, and such monuments were never built. The fields became anonymous, their purpose gradually forgotten by those who had not lived through the plague. As winter yielded to spring, London began to revive. It was not a return to what had been before. Much had changed. Too many had died. Too much of the social and economic structure had been damaged for simple restoration. But it was a beginning of something, a rebuilding that would eventually create a different London, altered by the experience of surviving catastrophe. The markets grew busier, the workshops reopened, the churches filled again with congregants. Life, which had seemed so fragile and uncertain during the dark months of winter, persisted and began slowly to recover its routines. The plague did not vanish completely. Throughout 1349, sporadic cases appeared in London and across England. Small outbreaks would occur, killing dozens before subsiding. The disease had become endemic, a permanent feature of the landscape, something that would return in waves for centuries. But the great mortality of 1348 to 1349, the overwhelming first wave that killed perhaps a third of England's population, was passing. London had survived, diminished and traumatized, but still functioning, still alive, still capable of continuing into whatever future awaited it. Chapter 10. The Unearthed Evidence. The centuries passed over London like the turning of pages in an ancient book, each era adding its layer to the palimpsest of the city. The fields where plague victims had been buried in those desperate months of 1348 and 1349 were gradually forgotten. Buildings rose over Smithfield. Streets were laid across the Stepney burial ground. The parish churchyards that had seemed overflowed with the dead were built up, expanded, built up again until the medieval ground level lay buried beneath feet of accumulated earth and human remains. London grew upward and outward, consuming its past, building its future on the bones of those who had come before. The memory of the Black Death persisted in chronicles and parish registers, in the careful Latin script of monks who had recorded the catastrophe, in the administrative documents that noted the transfer of properties from the dead to the living. But the physical evidence, the actual graves where thousands had been laid to rest, disappeared beneath the city's relentless expansion. By the 17th century, few Londoners could have pointed to the exact location of the plague burial grounds. By the 19th century, even scholars who studied medieval history could only guess based on documentary sources where the mass graves might be. The 20th century brought new tools for recovering the past. Archaeology, which had once been little more than treasure hunting, developed into a rigorous scientific discipline. Excavation techniques improved. Methods for dating remains became more sophisticated. The development of urban archaeology, the systematic investigation of city sites before modern development destroyed them, created opportunities to investigate London's layered past. Yet even with these advances, the plague burials remained largely hidden, occasional discoveries rather than systematic excavations. In the winter of 1986, construction workers preparing a site near the Charterhouse in Smithfield broke through into an unexpected void. Their excavator had punched through a layer of Victorian construction debris and centuries of accumulated soil to reveal a cavity filled with human bones. Work stopped immediately. The authorities were notified. Archaeologists from the Museum of London arrived to investigate. What they found was a portion of one of the medieval plague trenches, undisturbed since it had been filled in 1349. The excavation revealed bones packed densely together, layer upon layer, exactly as the medieval gravediggers had arranged them. Skulls and long bones jumbled without order, the natural articulation of skeletons lost because the bodies had been thrown into the pit in haste. The sheer density of remains was shocking even to archaeologists accustomed to cemetery excavations. This was not a normal burial ground where individuals had been interred carefully over generations. This was a mass grave, evidence of catastrophic mortality, testimony to an event that had killed too many too quickly for normal burial practices to be maintained. The bones themselves told stories that documents could not. Analysis revealed that all ages were represented, from infants to the elderly, men and women in roughly equal numbers. The bones showed signs of generally good health before death, adequate nutrition, normal development. These were not people who had been weakened by chronic disease or malnutrition. They had been healthy Londoners struck down by an acute infection. Some skeletons showed evidence of the plague itself, bone changes in the spine and ribs consistent with severe systemic infection, though most plague deaths occurred too quickly to leave marks on bone. The Smithfield discovery prompted increased attention to plague archaeology. Other construction projects across London began to uncover similar mass burials. In 1991, excavations at the Royal Mint site east of the tower revealed another plague cemetery, likely the Stepney Field mentioned in medieval documents. In 2013, preparatory work for the Crossrail project, a massive railway construction cutting beneath central London, uncovered a plague burial ground at Charterhouse Square, very near the 1986 discovery. This excavation proved to be one of the most significant plague archaeology projects ever undertaken. The Crossrail excavation at Charterhouse Square was conducted over several months in 2013. Archaeologists worked carefully, documenting everything, removing bones for analysis, treating the medieval dead with the respect that had been impossible during the plague itself. They uncovered portions of multiple burial trenches containing the remains of at least 42 individuals. The skeletal remains were in remarkable condition, preserved by the thick London clay that had sealed the trenches for more than 6.5 centuries. Modern scientific techniques could extract information from these bones that would have seemed miraculous to medieval minds. DNA analysis became possible in the early 21st century, allowing researchers to identify pathogens from ancient remains. Teams of scientists from multiple universities worked with the Charterhouse Square skeletons, carefully extracting minute samples of bone and tooth enamel, searching for preserved DNA from the bacterium that had caused the Black Death. The research confirmed what historians had long believed, but could not prove conclusively. The Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that causes bubonic plague in the modern world. The DNA recovered from 14th century London victims matched the genetic signature of plague. Further analysis revealed that the medieval strain was ancestral to all modern plague strains, suggesting that the Black Death represented a major evolutionary event in the disease's history, perhaps a mutation that made it more virulent than earlier or later forms. The bones also revealed details about life in medieval London that complemented historical documents. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel showed that most of the Charterhouse Square victims had grown up in London, their diet consistent with urban life in 14th century England. A few individuals showed isotope signatures indicating they had grown up elsewhere, perhaps in rural areas, and migrated to London as adults. The plague had struck both long-time Londoners and recent, arrivals, native-born and immigrant alike. Evidence of previous injuries and healed diseases appeared in the skeletons. Broken bones that had mended, dental abscess, signs of childhood illnesses survived. These people had lived full lives before the plague claimed them. They had worked, raised families at ease, survived the normal dangers of medieval existence, only to be cut down by a pestilence that medicine could not combat and that faith could not prevent. Their bones bore witness to both the resilience of medieval life and its ultimate fragility. The archaeological discoveries transformed scholarly understanding of the Black Death in London. Documentary sources had provided names, dates, administrative responses, but the bones provided human reality. The sheer density of remains in the mass graves made visceral what statistics could only suggest abstractly. 1/3 of London's population had died. That meant tens of thousands of people. The bones at Smithfield and Charterhouse Square represented perhaps 1 or 2% of the total dead, yet even that small sample was overwhelming in its testimony to mass mortality. Modern archaeologists who worked on the plague excavations often reflected on the emotional impact of their work. They were handling the remains of people who had lived through one of history's greatest catastrophes, who had experienced fear and loss on a scale difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. The archaeologists treated the bones with reverence, aware that these were not merely scientific specimens but human beings who deserved dignity even in death. Dignity that the crisis of 1348 to 1349 had denied them. The excavated remains were studied extensively, then reburied with ceremony. In 2014, the bones from the Crossrail excavation were interred in a consecrated section of the Museum of London's Archaeological Archive. A memorial service was held, attended by archaeologists, church officials and members of the public. Prayers were said, much as they would have been said in 1349, finally providing the individual attention that had been impossible during the plague. It was a small gesture, centuries delayed, but it acknowledged the humanity of those who had died in the distant past. The discoveries at Smithfield and elsewhere in London were part of a broader pattern of plague archaeology across Europe. Mass graves from the Black Death period were found in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Germany. Each excavation added details to the overall picture. The plague had struck everywhere, urban and rural areas alike, killing rich and poor, young and old, pious and sinful. It had been the defining event of the 14th century, an experience that shaped European society for generations. The physical evidence supported what written sources had long claimed about the plague's impact. The disease had been devastating. The social disruption had been profound. The psychological trauma had been immense, but the bones also testified to human resilience. London had survived. The city had rebuilt. Within a generation, the population had begun to recover. Within a century, London was larger and more prosperous than it had been before the plague. The catastrophe had not ended English civilization. It had transformed it, but not destroyed it. Modern historians, armed with both documentary sources and archaeological evidence, could now tell the story of the Black Death with unprecedented detail and authority. They could describe not just what happened, but how it felt, not just the statistics, but the human experience. The plague had killed millions across Europe, perhaps half the continent's population. London had lost perhaps 15,000 people, a third of its inhabitants. Those who survived had endured months of fear and loss, had watched their city come apart, had lived through the breakdown of social order and the failure of every institution meant to provide security and meaning. Yet they had continued. They had buried their dead, had maintained what could be maintained, had adapted when adaptation was necessary, had survived when survival seemed impossible. The resilience demonstrated by the 14th century Londoners was perhaps the most important lesson the archaeological evidence could teach. Humans can endure catastrophes that seem beyond endurance. Communities can survive losses that seem unsurvivable. Life continues even after events that appear to be endings. The night has grown deep now, and our journey through the winter of 1348 draws to its close. We have walked the silent streets of plague-stricken London, have stood at the edges of mass graves, have witnessed the failure of medicine and the overwhelm of faith, have seen a great city brought to its knees by an enemy too small to see and too powerful to resist. We have accompanied those who died and those who survived, those who fled and those who remained, those who despaired and those who endured. The bones lie quiet now beneath London streets, beneath office buildings and train stations, beneath the endless activity of a modern city that has long forgotten the fields where thousands were buried in desperate haste. But they remain, silent testimony to what was endured, permanent record of suffering and survival both. Every street in modern London is built on layers of the past, and among those layers are the mass graves of the Black Death, the physical foundation upon which centuries of subsequent history were constructed. We who live in easier times can only imagine what it meant to survive such catastrophe. We can study the documents, examine the bones, reconstruct the sequence of events, but we cannot truly know the fear that gripped a city watching death spread from house to house, the grief of losing family after family, the exhaustion of gravediggers who buried thousands, the despair of physicians whose every treatment failed, the loneliness of dying alone because no one dared approach. These experiences belong to the past, to the people who lived them, to the bones that rest in London's earth. Yet something connects us across the centuries. We share humanity with those who died in 1348. We share the same capacity for fear and hope, for suffering and resilience, for love and loss. The plague victims of medieval London are not so different from us. They wanted safety for their families. They wanted to survive. They wanted their lives to have meaning and their deaths to be remembered. In telling their story, in uncovering their graves, In treating their bones with reverence, we honour that connection. We acknowledge that they were people like us, worthy of memory and respect. The Black Death did end, as all things end. The plague burned through its pool of susceptible victims and gradually diminished in virulence. By 1350, the worst was over, though the disease would return in waves for centuries. London recovered, rebuilt, grew larger and more prosperous. The generation that survived the plague saw changes they could never have imagined before it struck. Labour shortages gave workers unprecedented bargaining power. Social structures that seemed permanent proved flexible. The certainties of the medieval world were shaken, and in the shaking, space opened for new possibilities. But that is another story for another night. Tonight, our tale concludes here, in the quiet darkness, with the bones beneath London's streets and the memory of what they represent. The candle burns low, the chamber falls silent, and history once again turns its page in the dark. Rest well and remember.